Okay, awesome. We are live. Let me take a drink so I don't sound like a 5-year-old.
Aww.
Hello and welcome to the Very TV Rewatch of Hannibal.
Hannibal.
I love the murder.
That's how we should introduce every single episode ever.
Welcome to Hannibal.
For real though, if podcasting and journalism doesn't work out for you, my friend, like Disney World would hire you in a second.
Oh, have I ever done my Mickey for you?
No.
Oh boy.
Oh, that's good. That's very good.
Like it's getting there. I can practice. My grandpa used to do an amazing Donald Duck actually, which is very random.
Oh, I love people who can do Donald.
It's apparently really easy if you know the trick, but the trick is really hard.
Yeah. It's like I feel like people who are learning a language like German or something, where you're using your entire throat, you know what I mean? Like as opposed to where you're using everything, would be okay to do it, but I can't.
That helps. And I think Donald Duck is probably the perfect segue. Let me see. Okay, I have my notes out. You have your notes.
Mm-hmm.
And we're good. Okay. So hello and welcome to the Very TV Rewatch of Hannibal. My name is Jonathan Dornbush. I'm joined with Julia Alexander.
Hey!
And we're going to be going through Bryan Fuller's NBC drama / crazy show, but awesome show, Hannibal, which is based on the characters from Red Dragon or Silence of the Lambs, as you may know them. So we're going to go episode by episode every week through a new episode of the show, starting with episode 1 of season 1, which is Apéritif. So if you have not seen Apéritif, stop listening. Go watch Apéritif because it's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Then come back and we'll talk about it with you. But we're going to go through the whole show, full spoilers, so be warned in advance. So just generally so people know, I've seen the first season completely before. Julia, you have not seen the show before at all.
No, and the rule I'm giving myself with this one, because I'm watching it on Netflix, and because it's on Netflix, it's so readily available at my fingertips, I think it'll be much more fun for this podcast and for myself if I'm going to watch it once a week. So I'm going to watch it kind of on Saturday, Friday, or my day off, and then that way we'll be good to talk about that one episode, as opposed to binging it all and forgetting details.
Which I think is great, and honestly, this is a show I think it's worth the wait between each week. I think it's a show I wanted to binge, but I was watching it when it was live. And it honestly made it feel it was more exciting for me to be able to sort of wait each week and see just the craziness that Bryan Fuller comes up with every week. So if listeners can do that too, please wait week by week. We'll be going through. It's worth it.
Oh yeah.
But so anyway, just generally, I'll talk about the pilot very briefly. It is called Apéritif. I don't know if you've looked at any other titles for episodes, but they're all different names for different courses.
Yes.
Yeah. So Apéritif is obviously the first one, and it's about Will Graham, who's played by Hugh Dancy. He is an FBI special investigator who's brought on board this series of gruesome murders, which I think gruesome is probably a word we'll use a lot in the next few episodes of the show. He's brought in by Special Agent Jack Crawford, who's played by Lawrence Fishburne, because Will Graham is really good at being able to empathize with killers, basically with anyone, but he has a very interesting way of sort of understanding a killer's mind.
Mm-hmm.
But along the way, he's also brought in is noted psychiatrist Dr. Hannibal Lecter, played by Mads Mikkelsen, who you may remember as Anthony Hopkins. And so the show sort of goes on through there for the main murder. But so just generally, what did you think of the pilot overall? And we'll get into
I thought it was one of the best pilots I've seen in recent years. I think pilots are, we've talked about this on the podcast before, but it's tricky territory. You're trying to introduce audiences to characters, but you're trying to get the ball rolling, and so a lot of it comes in. Do you start right from the beginning and it's as an introductory course? Do you kind of let the ball get rolling and hopefully audiences will pick it up, kind of like Leftovers did to some extent?
Yeah.
And I think this just hit it perfectly, and I think it's a smart psychological thriller, which is very akin to what Red Dragon and Silence of the Lambs was. They weren't horror; it was psychologically thrilling, and I do see a lot of, which we'll talk about later on in the episode, but I see a lot of commonalities between Clarice, who is played by Jodie Foster in Silence of the Lambs, and Hugh Dancy's Will Graham. And I've got more to say on that, but I think just my final kind of thought really quickly on the episode is just to show it, as much as like the Nick was finally a show that that directors have a place in television and they can make extraordinary work. I think Hannibal does that for cinematography. I think the cinematography in that show steals the spotlight.
Yeah. The show, the pilot is, watching it for me, it was funny because as I'm watching it, I just said to myself a few times, I was like, wow, I remember why I love this show so much. Like, it is just so good. And like a lot of people bemoan how network TV has kind of gone down in recent years and cable has taken over, but like this is just so good. And a lot of it does have to do with the visual quality of it, which the director was David Slade, who he's done a few movies. He did Hard Candy and one of the Twilight movies randomly. But he's kind of amazing.
Hard Candy's a great movie.
He's kind of amazing with TV. Have you seen the pilot for Awake?
No.
It was a very short-lived NBC drama. The pilot for that show is easily one of like my top pilots ever made. It's perfect. It's like a perfect pilot, and it's in large part due to his work. But yeah, I think the visual style is sort of where I want to start because from the very first scene, you get sort of how Will Graham's mind works, and it's shown visually with like that wipe that goes across the screen.
Yes.
And how Will puts himself into the actual violence itself, and he becomes the killer in his mind, so that he can understand it. And like the lighting is different. It's much warmer colors in those scenes where it's really pulled back in the rest of the episode. And yeah, I think just the whole visual style, it's so arresting, and just like the muted color palette, but also just the set design of everything. It's just gorgeous. It's a gorgeous show.
It instantly reminded me, but much better, I mean tenfold better, of some of the early seasons of Criminal Minds, where Reed or Morgan, or specifically Gideon, would be in a crime scene, and they would do the same kind of thing where they would put themselves in the killer's shoes, and they would speak out loud. Okay, if I was the killer, what would I be doing? Like, how would I get here? How would I get here? And then they kind of visually dramatize it. But what they didn't do, because that was much more of a detective show than it was a psychological thriller, it was a very brief look into it. They weren't made out to kind of be, with the exception of maybe Reed, who's this genius, they weren't made out to be extremely interesting characters. They were just kind of a team, and it was a very team-driven show. With Hannibal, it's really interesting to watch as Hugh Dancy, who plays Will Graham, kind of has these slight panic attacks while he's working things out. I mean, he literally, or not literally, but he very much so puts himself into the shoes of the killer, and he, as we learn in the episode, because he's able to empathize with them, because he's able to see things exactly from their perspective, he's able to jump to conclusions that other detectives and other psychologists just simply cannot. But because of that, he's become very jaded and a very fearful individual. And I thought the first opening scene, with the way that he looks almost pained as he's watching the husband and the wife kind of come together, and one's coming down the stairs, and he violently attacks them as the killer would. You can see how it affects him. And I thought, there hasn't been a show that's done such a visually arresting moment like that in quite some time, and it was from the get-go. I was absolutely hooked.
Yeah. That opening is a fantastic introduction to the show, and I think what it does really, it's so much of the visual stuff, but it also leads to things without spoiling. Just how he says like, "This is my design." That's sort of become like a big rallying cry, like as a line that fans use all the time. And something that comes up a lot in the show, just sort of as his mantra when he's trying to figure out what these killers were doing, like what the design of their murder was. But yeah, something that I wanted to touch on with Will, I think it's really interesting that they pretty much get out of the way pretty quickly that he has, he's got a different mental state. Someone asks him like, where on like the scale of the spectrum are you? And he kind of talks about like in relation to Asperger's, what his mind is at.
And autism, yeah.
Yeah, and I thought that was a really good way of like sort of addressing it and then quickly just getting it out of the way, because obviously it's a thing that would come up, but it never detracts from him, and I thought that was a good way to just address it and move on.
Yes.
But one thing that I think is really interesting, and I just kind of want to know what you think about it, So the show is obviously called Hannibal, and thus it is about Hannibal, which we all know from Silence of the Lambs. But Hannibal himself, I clocked it. He doesn't appear until more than 22 minutes into the show.
Yes, he appears halfway through.
You actually don't see his face until I think it was like 22 minutes and like 2 seconds, and then it cuts to commercial. But I thought that was really interesting and a smart sign of like the restraint of the show and how the show is also unrestrained in how sort of terrifying its imagery can be. But I loved that he's introduced so late into the show, and I guess you don't see too much of Hannibal in this episode. But what did you think of Mads Mikkelsen so far?
So from the very first moment that Mads Mikkelsen is introduced, and I did the same thing, I thought it was really interesting that they kept it, that they prolonged his appearance, which is very Silence of the Lambs-like, though, because in Silence of the Lambs, you're introduced to Clarice and her past, and her ambition in the FBI way before you're introduced to Anthony Hopkins as his killer. But what I really liked about it was just how they introduced him. The image of him in the kind of purple burgundy suit, with the gentle piano it's really creepy playing in the background, and there's a soft kind of light overhead, and there's this gourmet dinner and vibrant red wine, and he cuts himself a little piece of meat and eats it, and you know from that, you just know that that's Hannibal. You are very aware of it, and the way it's introduced is with Will Graham figuring out that the killer was eating his victims, and he's eating them, and then it cuts to Hannibal. And I just thought anytime that Mads Mikkelsen is in a scene with food, or rather a body part, it's fantastically filmed, and it's set, and the director of photography does an excellent job in setting up every single shot, and the cinematography for me really steals the show. I mean, that against the musical backdrop is just, it could be a silent episode or a wordless episode, and I would be just as hooked. Although the writing is fantastic, and Bryan Fuller does a great job in the pilot of writing it and really giving a voice to Graham, which I really appreciated, Mads Mikkelsen is just silently cast, like, he casts this silent charm, you know what I mean? And you're, from the very first moment you see him, he hasn't spoken, all he's done is taken a bite of meat, which you're assuming is human flesh. You're just hooked on him. You want to know more about him, and I thought that was the definition of a perfect team up between directing and cinematography and photography in general and acting, and I thought it was great.
Yeah. I mean, the whole show, it just feels like all of the parts are working together towards this whole, rather than just like a couple really strong things, and that makes up for the stuff that's not so great. And I mean, like, the show, it knows like it's in this genre of psychological thriller, horror-esque sort of things. Like, there's a scene where Will and Jack are having a conversation in a bathroom that's very much modeled off the bathroom from The Shining.
Yes.
Which there are things like that along the way that they always kind of nod at other horror movies, but I just kind of love that it's always going through, like, everything is very peculiar and, like, not peculiar, but it's very specific. Like, it knows what it wants every scene to sort of show.
Exactly.
And going back to, I think, just how you're talking about, like, the costume design in the show is great. Every time Hannibal is on the scene, he's always in these very, like, lavish, very fancy-looking suits. But you know he's a cannibal. And it's kind of like, it's this perfect, like, juxtaposition of this horrible person who has this veneer of just, like, austerity and, like, high class.
Which I thought one of the best moments with food, because I feel, and I haven't seen it, but I feel like food, definitely within the first season, is probably a very important scene in all the episodes, because, as we know, Hannibal is a cannibal. But the show never outright says it, to be fair. Like, we would know technically from having seen Silence of the Lambs, but for someone who's maybe never seen that and is just watching Hannibal, they never say, in this pilot at least, like, Hannibal is... Of course. Yeah. But anyway, go ahead. No, you're right. Actually, we should address that. Yeah, so I went in with the preconceived notion that Hannibal was a cannibal because of, Silence of the Lambs and Red Dragon. But if you had never seen those and never even, I guess, heard of them, because he's so popular in, pop culture-wise.
Yeah.
If you hadn't heard about it, you wouldn't know that he was a cannibal. Although there is a scene where he's cutting up the lungs.
Which is true, but you never see him commit the murder, I guess is just what I mean, which I like. I like that they never show it outright, but, like, you can infer it pretty easily.
Mm-hmm. And the scene where he goes to Will's room and they share breakfast together. And it's kind of this really interesting moment because as much as Will is learning about himself through conversation with Hannibal, I mean, Hannibal's a psychologist and they have a great conversation. There's an interesting moment where Hannibal kind of is listening to Will Graham discuss how he figured out that the other guy was cannibal and his work, and they both learn from each other. They mentor each other and they study each other, and I think it's a really interesting relationship between the two, which I know is very popular online. It's their relationship is very much so talked about. But I think the scene where he gives Will the food and Will bites in and grabs the sausage and bites in and he goes, "This is really great." And you're kind of, although they never explicitly or never even really imply that it's human flesh, coming into it as somebody who watched the previous Hannibal movies, you're kind of like, you're eating human meat, friend. That's what you're eating, and it's this. And what it does really well that I really appreciate is that it's horrific, but not in an American Horror Story, blatantly in your face. Here's why it's horrifying, horrific. It's very subtle. It's very avant-garde. And I really appreciate that. It lets the viewer, it respects the audience's intelligence, which I don't think many shows do, and I think that's why many shows prefer to inflict gore, because it's, maybe you won't understand this suggestion, so I'm just going to put it out there for you. But this show respects the intelligence of the audience and respects their understanding of what's happening, and that, the subtlety of it is one of my favorite aspects of the show.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this on the Very TV podcast proper. I think that's maybe why I didn't like American Horror Story as much, or things like The Following, because I think it's like the violence is too out there, and I've seen that so much already, and I kind of, like, I get the point, and
yes.
I've had enough of it. Not saying that those shows can't do it well, but I think certainly something like The Following, it almost glorifies the violence in a weird way. Whereas, like, Hannibal, and not to spoil anything, but there are some pretty disturbing imagery that's going to come up, but it never feels like it's being, like, trying to throw it in your face. It feels like it's very much a part of, it's about the psychology of these characters and not just about, like, here's a crazy image, although the imagery gets crazy. It's very much about exploring who they are, the mindset of Hannibal versus Will Graham, and I mean, I do like that sort of interplay, how they, technically, in the end, Will is hunting Hannibal, but he doesn't know it. And the fact that they're working together makes that kind of like, it could almost come off as like farce because it's so crazy. The idea that he's working with the guy he's trying to catch as the show goes on, if we presume they get to like the years where he's Hannibal as we know him. And I think, but they play it so well because these characters are so interesting together, and also just their individual psychologies are so interesting. It's just so fascinating to watch.
And that's what I really enjoyed. I think that it's not that one is more interesting than the other. And I really respect Bryan Fuller for creating an entirely new show, but bringing in so much of the previous themes from Silence of the Lambs in particular, that it fan panders, which you would have to do a little bit with a show called Hannibal, but it doesn't at the same time. It's its own entity. But there's so much that I see of Clarice in Will Graham, and the relationship between, and what I really appreciated about Silence of the Lambs was that neither Clarice nor Hannibal were more interesting than the other. They were both interesting individuals with interesting psychological deformities. Like they were both
in their own ways, yeah.
In their own ways, and that you get that with Will and with Hannibal and with Mads Mikkelsen and Hugh Dancy. They're both interesting and devastatingly, just outcast from the rest of the world. I think. Yeah, their conversations are something you just want to watch. Usually a conversation between two people can get a little redundant, which is why television shows you have a huge cast. You bring in more than one person, or more than two people rather, because, it gets a little boring.
Yeah.
But I would watch an episode dedicated to just them two having, like, a session, like in treatment. I would watch it in treatment based with these two characters.
Yeah, and the main cast stays pretty small. I think Jack, Will, Hannibal, Dr. Bloom, who we haven't talked about. The four of them are sort of the main cast throughout. There a couple people come in as recurring roles, but it's very much them as like the main core of the show.
Yes.
And I think also sort of something about it, because obviously it's going to be serialized in the sense that it's about sort of them trying to find out who Hannibal is, but also just trying to solve these murders in general. The show also does a really good thing of setting up its like case of the week nature. With the initial episode, I don't know if like I'd say probably the case itself is like the part I cared about the least in the pilot. Though I was interested, it's definitely just I was so much more invested in who these characters were than sort of finding out the murder. But I guess we can talk about that a bit. Like, what did you think of how it wraps up towards the end with sort of the attack at, I'm forgetting the man's name, but at his house?
Oh, yes.
Garrett Jacob Hobbs.
I thought that was one of the least interesting parts of the show. I mean, yeah. It was a great ending, but in context to the rest of the show, which was quite spectacular to watch, I thought it lacked a little something, but what I really appreciated was seeing Will finally snap. I think up until that moment, the only other time we see him really emotional is when he's driving home and he rescues the dog, and he kind of has that really horrific nightmare, and he lays the towels down, and you can see him shaking in fear as he tries to get himself to sleep. Or the only other moment I can think of is when he kind of has a brief panic attack when when his thoughts are interrupted at the crime scene by the other FBI investigator.
Yeah.
But he's usually reserved, and he's very much so watching how he is around people and watching his own psyche. And so it was great to see him snap. And I think, which leads me to one of my what I really like about the show is they do a really great job of showcasing his fear, which, as we know, is a big part of it. Because in the show they discuss how fearful he is, because he can empathize, he's scared all the time. And they do a really great job of showcasing that fear. And I wrote this down because I knew I was going to forget it. He's fearful of the fact, I think, that he can empathize so well. He sees these monstrous people, and he because he understands it, he almost feels like he could become that. And that's not a trope, but it's something that is not executed very well that many shows try to do. And the only other show I really thought they did a great job with that was Criminal Minds with Reed. Sherlock tries to do it. House tries to, and it's this idea of these geniuses who are psychologically not all there. So here's why they could go down the wrong path.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't come off that way, and eventually that gets left alone. But with Criminal Minds and Reed and his schizophrenic kind of past with his mother, and with Will Graham's connection to these mass serial killers, it's interesting to see his fear come from his empathy. It's what makes him great will be his greatest downfall kind of scenario. Yeah,
and I think him pulling the trigger, it's sort of implied. I don't know I forget if it is, but it feels like it's his first time pulling a gun. And obviously, I think the fear is right there. It's does this make me as bad as the people I'm hunting? Whether or not he's doing a good thing, does that make me as bad? And that sort of progression of his mental state or regression as the show goes on, I think that's one of the plots that I so look forward to seeing how that happens. Because obviously, in a way, the main draw is supposed to be Hannibal, and I think Mads Mikkelsen does such a great job, but I think Hugh Dancy is sort of the uncredited MVP of the show as Will Graham.
Yes.
And what he has to go through every week will be crazy, but especially even in this pilot, he is he's gone through a lot of shit, and he conveys it so well.
It's a very physical role, which I wasn't expecting, and not physical in the sense that it's violent or very action-driven, but physical in that he's shaking, or the sheer look on his face with terror, and it's it looks the character is drained emotionally, mentally, physically from not being able to sleep, and the actor and Hugh Dancy does a really good job of portraying that.
Yeah, he gets as much across in his words as he does in his face. Which you hope actors can do, but he just does it so well. Lines, I wrote a few down where he's just that may require me to be sociable when they're asking him to come onto the case, or he's talking with Hannibal about how he builds forts in his mind, and Hannibal's well, certain things come along really easily, and he's just well, so do forts, but he also won't look him in the eye because he doesn't he feels that distracts him.
The whites, are they really whites or
Yeah, all that stuff was sort of great, and also, and just the sort of devastation that you see in him in that final scene when he kills Garrett Jacob Hobbs, and they're dealing with his daughter who's bleeding out on the ground. what I loved watching that scene over, I totally didn't recognize it the first time, and I don't know if you did, but as you see Will going into the house, Hannibal's just standing very calm and collected in the background.
Yes.
And they cut to him like once to show just how like careless, not careless, but he's just so like nonchalantly there. And and like obviously if Will were a sane in his mind person, like he would be like, why is this guy just okay with this happening? But because he doesn't see it, it works so well that like Hannibal like wanted this in a sense to happen, and watching it happen, he's just like sort of reveling in it.
Well, that's the beauty of Hannibal's nonchalance, which is a great word for it. It plays off so perfectly against Will's paranoid insanity that he tries to harbor. Because he's constantly thinking, because he's constantly living in his head and worried about him snapping or what he's going to think about, what he's going to discover, like that, which goes back to why he can't look people in the eyes because of the white. And then he starts thinking about, are they really white or is it hiding something? It's a great contrast to see that against the nonchalance of Hannibal, who has much more to fear than Will, but is just so confident and empowering in what he does and the person that he is and his intelligence, his immense intelligence, that he's able to keep it all at bay and just live and enjoy life. He enjoys life and he enjoys consuming life quite literally.
Figuratively and literally, yeah.
Figuratively and yeah.
And I do like how they sort of they set up a lot of Will's psyche throughout the episode, both in when he's discussing things with people, also when they show him with the dogs that he has, like he has dogs at home, and then also when he's talking to the other, I guess, coroners who are part of the FBI, the other scientists who are kind of examining the bodies, they're only there for like 5 minutes in the show, but they'll pop back up. But he as he's discussing things with them, you get to see how he is interacting with other people who are supposed to do his job, but he just does it on a different level, which I think is really cool to see.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I guess just generally, is there any other like big parts of the show that really struck you?
Well, I wrote down these here notes.
Yes.
So let me see. The problem is that
you can't read.
I'll show people if you can kind of see it. My writing is illegible.
Lovely. I should be a doctor with my handwriting, so it's okay.
Yeah, exactly. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. I don't think you have to go to medical school. I think you just show them your handwriting.
Exactly. I got to do tests on the computer because they were just like, we're not even going to bother with that. Yeah, and it worked out really well. One of the interesting sentences that kept coming up that I thought was really great, both literally and figuratively, was don't let him get too close to the case.
Yeah.
From the other
Dr.
Yes, who's great. And I thought in the moment, the final scene where, or not the final scene, but the scene where he shoots the other killer and he figures it out, and he's too close to realize, he gets too close to the case, but in that moment, he's also too close to realize that Hannibal is the one he should be going after. Do you know what I mean? Like, he's too close to it all. He works better when and you can see it when he goes to crime scenes, when he can sit at a distance and kind of distance himself from the case by putting himself, by injecting himself into it, as ironic as it is. He needs to be able to get into his mind and back away to connect to the case as closely as he can. And so the whole don't get too close to it, don't let him get too close, it's not good for him, I think just plays off the idea of fear and empathy and how much can his psyche take before he does snap, like we saw him when he shoots the killer. He was too close to it. And she says that at the end to Lawrence Fishburne. She says, you let him get too close.
Yeah. And
so it's this whole foreshadowing for this close relationship he's going to have with Hannibal, the amount of cases he's going to have to go on that are going to require him to get close to the minds and psyches of serial killers and deranged individuals. And I thought that was a really great simple line to include that could mean a bunch of different things, and speculation can run rampant with. And I thought that was just a great piece of writing from Bryan Fuller.
Oh yeah. We haven't talked about it too much, but I think Bryan Fuller's script is really great in this episode. I mean, it manages also to occasionally be really funny. And I was first introduced to Bryan Fuller through Pushing Daisies, which is obviously a much more lighthearted show. Granted, it's about death, but it's in a much more upbeat way. It's about death.
Oh, Lee Pace.
Lee Pace and Anna Friel, and Kristen Chenoweth. Wow, blanking.
Yes.
Bryan Fuller has really good casts on his shows. Um, but yeah, I think he gets it across just like the gravity of this situation while also making these characters not feel like caricatures of detectives or policemen or psychiatrists that we've seen before.
Yes.
And also, I think there's so much, like, there are expectations. Granted, that I'm sure there's one person who went into this not knowing a thing about who Hannibal Lecter was, but there are certain like expectations of the character of Hannibal, especially with Anthony Hopkins' fantastic performance. And I think in both the writing and Mads Mikkelsen's performance, he becomes so much of, he is that character, but he's also so much his own version of it.
Yes.
That I think had he not been, the show would end up having been a failure, because it sort of relies on that. But because he's so great in that role, and he makes it his own with his own sort of specificity, whether it's how he's eating people, or the beauty with which he cooks their insides, even though it's disgusting, it kind of looks pretty good as he's doing it.
Oh, the scene where he's chopping up the lungs is fantastic. It's, I mean, I would never go to someone and say, do you want lungs for dinner? Because they look really good, but those lungs looked amazing.
Yeah, it's, you have that sort of grappling in your mind with, you're like, he's eating humans, but he makes it look really good.
It's like if this was on the Food Network, I would watch this.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure that parody exists somewhere where there's like a Food Network YouTube series of like Hannibal cooking.
And if it doesn't, it should now.
It should, exactly. But yeah, it's not for the faint of heart, the show, but I think what it does well, it does so spectacularly well, and like I said before, it's all parts of it. It's Bryan Fuller's script, it's David Slade's directing and the cinematography, it's the acting of the characters, whether it's Will Graham and Hannibal and Mads Mikkelsen are so at the center of it, or even if it's just when Jack Crawford or Alana Bloom appear for 5 minutes. It's all of it. It's the set design. I think Hannibal's office, which you don't see all of it in this episode, you get to see more of it later on. It's a gorgeous set. And it's so like spectacularly like his. It fits him perfectly. It's so neat, but it's so cluttered with different things. I just love all facets.
And what I really like what they did with Hannibal's character, and I have this written down, and it kind of reminded me of what Elementary did with Sherlock when Johnny Lee Miller, was it modernized it in a way that felt authentic but still paid homage to its predecessor. I mean, Johnny Lee Miller as Sherlock is definitely not like Cumberbatch or Downey Jr. or any of the other Sherlock incarnations, thousands of them. But it's modern, and it's an interesting take, and it grapples with the psychological issues that he would have had, really, and it addresses the alcoholism and the narcotics addiction and his insanity. And I think that's what I really like about what they did with Hannibal and Hugh Dancy, like you said, with the autism right off the bat. And Hannibal, where he says, "Don't psychoanalyze me, 'cause I can psychoanalyze you," kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so they're Bryan Fuller brings to the forefront, instead of just letting it kind of bubble in the background and boil, and he asks the questions and he answers them, and he goes, "Yeah, we know that he's insane and a kind of a cannibal." He implies, "We know that there's something wrong with you, Dancy. Here's what it is." And it just gets it right out of the way and lets the story develop without having to wonder what is going on with them. And I think that's a great story from somebody who knows how to do great storytelling.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's it feels different but perfectly in Bryan Fuller's wheelhouse. And just from the start, you feel like he has such a great handle on these characters and where the show is going. And the pilot like tells you enough without revealing too much, but also planting enough seeds that you want to keep seeing what's going to happen next. That makes me really excited for episode 2. I hope you're excited for episode 2.
Yes.
Were there any other sort of points about the pilot you wanted to cover that we did not?
No, I just want to end it off by saying like that cinematography is some of the best cinematography I've seen in a show, and best directing. I mean, the two of them together in combination with the Nick that I'm watching now is just such a refreshing take on television. I'm so thankful that directors and cinematographers and writers are all working together in this medium and crafting this amazing third golden age of television. I think we're in a really, really privileged and lucky time period for television right now, and I can't wait to see what the rest of the season brings.
Oh yeah, definitely. And David Slade does come back. They match his visual style pretty much all throughout, but he comes back to direct episode 3 and the finale of the season. So we'll see his crafty work again. And if you have an hour, I highly recommend watching the Awake pilot. It works perfectly, almost as a mini movie.
Excellent. I remember hearing about it.
His directing on it is just gorgeous. So yeah, all credit to David Slade for doing amazing work on TV. And I hope he does more of it. But yeah, I think other than that, that wraps it up for this this appetizer, you could say, into our Very TV Rewatch. I'm so sorry. What am I doing? We'll be back next week with episode 2 of Hannibal season 1. So if you have not watched, make sure to watch that beforehand. If you have any comments about this episode or about the next upcoming episode, feel free to email us at theverytvpodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to talk the show with us, you can find us on Twitter. I'm at JMDormbush, and Julia.
I'm at LoudMouthJulia.
So talk to us about Hannibal, any other shows we cover on the Very TV podcast. This is the Very TV Rewatch, or just anything on TV in general. We watch a lot of TV. So chances are we can talk.
We watch a lot of TV.
Yeah. It's an illness, but we're okay with it. So if you're also not watching or listening, you can also watch us on YouTube, but also make sure to listen to the Very TV podcast proper, which comes out on Mondays, sometimes Tuesdays, every week, so be sure to catch out for that, and also our Very TV Rewatch of Community, slightly different show than Hannibal, but still a great show.
A little bit different. I mean, just as gory, really.
Yeah, pretty much. They're both horror, pretty much, I think we can say. But yeah, otherwise, thank you for joining me this week, Julia.
Thank you for having me.
I could make a really crappy "this is my design" joke. I won't. But until next week, we'll talk to you guys later.
Bye, guys.
All right. Stopping now.
Oh yeah, I should stop mine now too. Whee!